The sovereign arbiter of the Joint Sovereignty Commission had a gift for theatrics. I had watched him work twice before, once at the Veth Compact dissolution hearings, once at the Renely sanction vote, and I had come to understand that the length of his pauses was calibrated to the size of the audience. The longer the pause before the charge was read, the more certain he was that this moment would outlast him. He paused for a long time before reading ours. I was in the observer gallery, fourth tier, center left, close enough to see the delegation below without being seen myself. That was the job. I was not an envoy. I did not argue treaties or shake hands at the reception afterward. I sat in rooms and watched, and I wrote what I saw, and I carried the file home. 14 years of it. You learn, in that time, to read a chamber the way a physician reads a patient. Not the words, not the gestures, but the small things underneath. The angle of a councillor's posture before a vote. The way a clerk's pen pauses. The half-second of silence before a ruling is announced that tells you the ruling is not a surprise to everyone in the room. Below me, the human delegation sat at the long table reserved for petitioner parties. There were 4 of them. 3 I recognized, administrative staff, credentials people, there to manage paperwork and little else. The 4th was Carrie's. I had known Carrie's for 9 years. She had been a trade commissioner when I first filed a report that mentioned her name. Then she was a senior envoy. Then, for a period, she had been something harder to define, the kind of appointment whose title means nothing and whose authority means everything. She was compact, grey-haired, and she wore a dark coat without insignia. She was 61 years old and she had been present at 11 bilateral negotiations that had all gone, in the quiet estimation of anyone who studied them, entirely the way she intended. She was reading something when I found her in the gallery. A physical document, printed on plain paper, folded in thirds. She was not reading it with urgency. She was reading it the way someone reads a thing they have already memorized, checking a detail they already know. The sovereign arbiter cleared his throat. The chamber, tiered, semicircular, walled in brushed alloy with amber light strips running the length of each delegate row, went quiet. There were 91 member delegations seated in those tiers. 91 flags of the Commission's charter signatories in their display alcoves above the doors. The holographic resolution display above the floor read the session number and one phrase. Formal censure, Terran delegation. He began to read. The charges were not surprising. I had seen a draft, 3rd generation copy, handled twice before it reached me, and the final version tracked it closely enough. Violation of transit accords during the Kelvin Passage incident. Failure to register fleet movements with the Commission's Advance Notification Bureau. Unauthorized survey activity in the Doroth buffer zone. Each item delivered with the weight of settled law, which was the performance, treating contested interpretations as if they had been adjudicated, as if the record were closed, as if the reading of the charge were itself the verdict. The arbiter was good at this. His species communicated partly through subvocal resonance, a frequency in the lower register that humans could not consciously detect but that produced, I was told, a faint physiological effect of unease in most carbon-based bipeds. Useful in a censure session. I had brought earplugs the first time I sat through one of his readings. I had forgotten them today. It did not matter. I was watching Carrie's. She had folded the document and set it beside her right hand on the table. She was not looking at the sovereign arbiter. She was not looking at the resolution display. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere in the middle distance, the way a person looks when they are doing arithmetic in their head. There was the faint suggestion of an expression at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, exactly. The precursor to one. The thing a face does when it already knows where a sentence is going. The arbiter finished the charges. He allowed a pause, a long one, longer than the Veth Compact pause, longer than the Renely pause. Then he read the Commission's resolution. Terran delegation credentials suspended pending formal review. Terran observer status revoked for the current session. Terran representation at the subsidiary treaty tables frozen until the censure was resolved through the Commission's standard arbitration calendar, which ran, in the usual processing cycle, 14 to 22 months. 3 things at once, stacked.
Suspension, révocation, freeze.
The gallery above was the kind of silence that means the audience is deciding what expression to put on. Carrie's picked up the folded document. She stood. She did not push the chair back with any particular force. She did not look at the Commission tiers. She said one thing to the 3 staff members beside her, too quietly for me to hear, and they gathered their materials without haste. Then she walked to the clerk station at the near end of the floor, Not the exit, the clerk station, which was a small desk positioned between the petitioner table and the chamber doors, and she set the document on the edge of it, squared with the corner. She did not hand it to the clerk. She placed it. The way you place something when you are certain it will be found. Then she walked out. The chamber doors closed behind her with a sound that was barely a sound. Pneumatic seals, carbon composite, designed to reduce noise in session. They were very good at their job. The arbiter watched the doors for a moment. I watched him watching them. The session was not over. There were secondary motions to enter, acknowledgement votes, the procedural sequencing that turns a decision into a record. The Commission's legal counsel, a Vorath delegate named Shantarev, who had been sitting to the arbiter's right and who had not moved during the entire reading, leaned forward and picked up the document from the clerk station. He opened it. I watched his face. Shantarev was not a being who showed alarm easily. He had been Commission counsel for 19 years. He had overseen the drafting of 4 charter amendments. He was the kind of legal mind that approached crisis the way a civil engineer approaches a crack in a wall, with instruments, not emotion. He read a line. He went back and read it again. He turned to the second page. He went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, denser, slower at the edges, the way water goes still just before it freezes. He said something to the arbiter in the Commission's working language. Low, precise, clipped. I speak 11 languages. Commission working is not one of them. But I have spent enough years in chambers like this one to catch the word that repeats when a legal professional has found something they did not expect to find. It is not a word that translates cleanly. The closest I can manage is previously registered. The arbiter took the document. He read it. He passed it to his left, to the mediation registrar, who read it and passed it further down. I had been briefed on the document's contents. That was the job, knowing what the other hand was holding. But I had not seen the final filed version until now. What I knew was this: 11 months before this session, before the censure motion was tabled, before the Kelvin Passage incident was formally cited, the Terran Diplomatic Office had submitted a counter-registry to the Commission's administrative arm. Not to the floor. Not to the arbiter. To the administrative arm, the Bureau of Charter Compliance, specifically, which processed an average of 460 filings per month and which had received this one, assigned it a docket number, stamped it received, and filed it in the pending arbitration queue, where it had sat, quiet and patient, for 11 months. The counter-registry cited, with specific clause references, 11 outstanding treaty obligations owed by Commission member states to the Terran government, obligations that had been deferred, ignored, or reclassified in the years since the original agreements were signed. Some of them predated my career. One of them predated the current arbiter's appointment. None of that was the mechanism. The mechanism was a single clause in the Commission's own arbitration charter, Article 31, Subclause F, which most practitioners treated as a procedural formality so old it was essentially inert. Subclause F stated that any censure entered into the Commission's official record against a party with an active counter-registry in the Bureau queue automatically triggered mandatory expedited arbitration of that counter-registry, bypassing the standard calendar. Standard calendar, 14 to 22 months. Expedited, 60 days. And the censure, the sovereign arbiter's careful, resonant, pause-laden censure, entered into the official record 20 minutes ago, was the trigger. What the Commission had done, in the language of Subclause F, was acknowledge the existence of a dispute. What Carries had done, in the language of the same article, was present evidence of a registered counterclaim at the moment of acknowledgement. The procedure had clicked into place the way a lock clicks when the right key turns it, not with force, not with spectacle, just with the small, definitive sound of a mechanism completing its motion. The document moving along the arbiter's bench grew heavier with each pair of hands. I made a note. Below me, 3 of the 91 member delegations had begun low, private consultations. Not the large blocks, not yet. The smaller ones, the careful ones, the ones whose legal teams were already running the same calculation Shantarev was running. Within an hour, I knew, there would be 6. By evening, a dozen. Not because they were alarmed, necessarily, but because a precedent in motion is a thing every delegation with outstanding treaty exposure needs to understand before it finishes moving. There was one outstanding Terran counterclaim that specifically concerned 4 Commission members who had voted in favour of the censure this morning. I did not note that in my file. It would be in someone else's report before I finished writing mine. The arbiter set the document down with the particular care that people use when they are holding something they have just recognised as evidence. He looked at the doors through which carries had left. The chamber was not quiet now. The way sound begins to build in a large enclosed space when 91 delegations start processing the same information at slightly different speeds. It was more like the first low register of a frequency that has not yet resolved into a specific tone. I had seen carries work 11 bilateral negotiations. I had read the post-session analyses of 7 of them after the fact, when the terms that had seemed favourable to the other party at signing had been revealed, over months and years, to have been structured around clauses that only activated under specific conditions, conditions which, in every case, had eventually been met. She did not win arguments at the table. She built positions that made the table's outcome secondary. The censure session had been scheduled for 45 minutes. The arbiter called a recess at the 27-minute mark. This was the first recess he had called mid-session in, according to commission records, 6 years. I closed my notebook. Outside the gallery doors, in the long corridor that curved around the chamber's upper level, I stopped at the window. The city below was a grid of amber lights and movement, ordinary and unconcerned. Somewhere in it, Carries was in a transport back to the Terran mission office, almost certainly not thinking about the session anymore, almost certainly reading something else on paper in thirds. 11 months. She had filed the counter-registry 11 months ago, before the censure was proposed, before the Kelvin passage citations were formal, before any of this was visible to anyone watching the surface of things. I have spent 14 years sitting in rooms and writing what I see. The thing I have learned at the cost of some confidence in my own ability to see clearly, is that the most important part of most situations is the part that was arranged before you arrived. The document on the clerk's desk. The clause in an old charter that nobody invokes. The filing number stamped by a bureau that processes 460 items a month and does not know, when it stamps one of them, that it is starting a clock. The Joint Sovereignty Commission would spend the next 60 days in expedited arbitration over 11 treaty obligations it had been comfortable ignoring for years. The censure it had entered into the record, the formal, resonant, pause-laden censure designed to isolate and diminish, was the key that opened the lock. They called it a formal censure. Carries had filed the counter-registry and gone home and waited 11 months for someone to give her the chance to use it. I have been asked, since, whether she knew in the chamber that morning that it was going to work. Whether she was certain. Whether the slight set of her expression, that not quite smile at the corner of her mouth, was confidence or composure or something else. I don't know. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a woman who had already read the ending and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. That is the part they never account for. They measure what they can see, the delegation, the credentials, the floor access, the table where we sit. They do not measure what was done 11 months ago, in an office building, on a plain piece of paper, in a bureau that stamps 460 filings a month and does not know when it is changing something. The Commission entered a formal censure against the Terran delegation on a Thursday morning and triggered mandatory arbitration of every outstanding treaty obligation they had spent a decade avoiding. We called it a Tuesday. It was a Thursday, technically, but the feeling was the same.